The 1967-68 season for the Baltimore Clippers was a disaster. The beginning of the year began with so much optimism, with the team predicting they would finish in first place and win the Calder Cup. Then they would meet the Western League's Seattle Totems in an ultimate championship series as the AHL and WHL would formally merge to create a second major league of hockey. But after Willie Marshall broke his ankle on Christmas Eve and the Penguins promoted Bobby Rivard to Pittsburgh, the Clippers' injury-plagued roster eventually choked at the end of the season and finished in dead last place. The greatly anticipated merger never happened. After the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King several days later on April 4, 1968, which triggered horrific race riots in Baltimore and other major cities, optimism had become a rare commodity. But the hippies remained upbeat. A counterculture musical named Hair debuted on Broadway in April 1968. The show's opening number was an anthem of hope as it proclaimed that
this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, age of Aquarius, Aquarius.
Sorry, where was I? Oh yeah. Harmony and understanding, sympathy and trust abounding, no more falsehoods or derisions, golden living dreams of visions, mystic crystal revelation, and the mind's true liberation. Aquarius. Every year after the season was over, the Clippers would lose players, and General Manager Terry Reardon had the difficult task of trying to assemble a new team for the upcoming season on a very limited budget, and 1968 would be no different.
Very interesting.
The Clippers traded away their leading scorer, Tom McCarthy, to the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Leafs assigned McCarthy to Rochester, where he would score 31 goals, but after scoring only 5 times in 24 games in 1969, McCarthy would return to playing senior hockey in Canada. Dick Meisner was poached by the Providence Reds in the 1968 reverse draft, where he played for a couple of years before he eventually retired, never regaining the goal-scoring touch he showed with the Clippers. The Clippers had a major hole to fill when goalie Joe Daly was promoted by the Penguins and his backup Joe Boisvert retired during the summer. Daly would spend the entire 1968-69 season playing for Pittsburgh, splitting duties with former Cleveland Barons goalie Les Benkley. The Pittsburgh Penguins would give Billy LeCain a call-up for a handful of games, but Billy would soon return to Port Huron in the IHL, where he would play until 1974. Defenseman Les Hunt was sent back to the Western League, where he would play for the San Diego Gulls for one season, before also winding down his career in the international. Realizing that he would be more productive acting exclusively in the role of general manager, Reardon named defenseman Aldo Guidolin as his replacement as Baltimore's new player coach. The Baltimore fans have been expecting for Guidolin to be named coach ever since he was traded to Baltimore in 1966 with Bartlett and Willie Marshall. In 1962, Aldo replaced Red Sullivan mid-season and successfully coached a Baltimore Clippers team that made the playoffs on the last game in the Clippers' very first year. Ironically, the exact opposite of what happened in 1967 when the Clippers were eliminated by the Providence Reds in the final game of the season. In the June reverse draft, Terry was able to poach the captain of the Quebec Aces, Jim Morrison, and the president of the AHL Hockey Players Association. Morrison was a teammate of Bartlett in his first year playing junior hockey for the 1949-1950 Verdun Maple Leafs when Bartlett was only 17 years old. According to Guidolin, Morrison would help the team on the power play because although he was not much of a hitter, he was a tremendous puck carrier who can really control a game when he's on the ice. Terry also bought the contract for 34-year-old veteran right winger Keke Mortson. In 1962, Keke scored 35 goals and had 85 points as a rookie with the Hershey Bears, who were eliminated in Game 7 of the Calder Cup that year. After averaging 30 goals during the next 3 seasons with the Quebec Aces as a teammate of Morrison, Keke was named the second-team All-Star in 1965 when he led the league in assists. However, he scored only 15 goals in 1966, so he was sent to the Seattle Totems of the Western League. Though Keke scored only 11 goals with Seattle, he did help them win the Lester Patrick Cup that year. So Reardon thought he could coax another couple of good years out of him. According to the new coach Aldo Guidolin, in Mortson, the Baltimore fans can expect a player similar to Jimmy Bartlett. He's a tremendous playmaker, a strong skater, and he never shuts up when he's on the ice. Keke wasn't afraid to drop the mitts, and like Bartlett, the press always referred to him as colorful when describing him during his long professional career. Keke said about himself, "I don't have much finesse, but I hustle." Basically, hustle has carried me along through the years. Bartlett remembered that Keke was one of the only players of the day to wear a helmet. Keke was famous for his oversized helmet that, for some reason, never fit right, so it was always falling off. Bartlett told me that when they were opponents, he remembered Mortson wearing an orange helmet, so he would chirp at Mortson and call him Pumpkinhead. Jimmy said he would purposely hit Keke in order to make his helmet pop off and go flying across the ice. Bartlett would then give the helmet a little kick and would laugh and taunt him with, "Hey, Pumpkinhead, did you lose your fucking head again?" As always, there were two types of Clippers, those who were owned by Baltimore and those who were owned by an NHL team and were lent to the Clippers. The players owned by Baltimore were the forwards Jimmy Bartlett, Willie Marshall, Jean-Marie Cossette, Sandy McGregor, Bob Brinkworth, Eddie McQueen, Bob Cunningham, Duncan MacDonald, Keke Mortson, defenseman Nick Polano, Wally Chevrier, and player coach Aldo Guidolin. The Pittsburgh Penguins lent Baltimore several veteran wingers for the 68-69 season. After they acquired Wayne Hicks in a trade with Philadelphia, Pittsburgh lent the 31-year-old right winger to the Clippers. Hicks was another former star for the Quebec Aces, where he had scored 30 goals in 4 consecutive seasons before rejoining his former Aces teammates Jim Morrison and Keke Mortson as new members of the Clippers. Pittsburgh also lent the Clippers the 23-year-old rookie defenseman John Arbour, who had played for the Oklahoma City Blazers in the Central League the previous year. The Clippers' arrangement with Pittsburgh wasn't exclusive. Reardon was also able to negotiate a deal with the Detroit Red Wings, who lent Baltimore a 21-year-old rookie center named Dave Rochefort, who had played the previous year for Fort Worth Kings in the Central League, where he scored 15 goals. When I was a little kid, I was extremely precocious. I guess I just developed early for some unknown reason. When I was 3, I spoke like a 6-year-old. When I was 6, I was like a 10-year-old. I was sort of like Stewie on Family Guy. Unfortunately, my intellectual growth puckered out when I was about 10, and I've been stuck there ever since. I may have gained knowledge through experience throughout the years, but I have remained the exact same 10-year-old until this day. I definitely hit my peak when I was a toddler, and it's been downhill ever since. My dad was always proud of me and loved to show me off. He used to take me down into the dressing room after the games. All the players kept packs of chewing gum on a shelf behind the benches where they would sit to put on their skates, and I would sneak around and steal sticks of gum from the players when they weren't looking. I wasn't fooling anybody, but they all thought it was funny. Bartlett would then gather the whole team around me, and I would stand on this bench, and I would proudly and enthusiastically start singing, "When you Baltimore Clippers." I would sing the whole song, even the instrumental parts. The team loved it. My dad didn't make me sing. It was my idea. I wanted to show my favorite Clipper that I was his biggest fan. Now, my favorite player wasn't my dad. It was a 24-year-old rookie goalie named Andy Brown, who had been playing for a couple years for the Eastern League's Johnstown Jets when Terry Reardon found him and invited him to training camp to replace Joe Daly. My mother, Kelly, named me Steve after Hollywood's King of Cool, Steve McQueen, but to me, nobody was cooler than Andy Brown. He was a race car driver in the off-seasons, which was pretty cool, but I didn't know about that at the time. And even though it's been broken, Brownie once held the NHL record for penalty minutes in a season by a goalie while playing in only 34 games, which is also pretty badass. But in my mind, what made Andy Brown so cool is that he never wore a goalie mask. During the 1950s, goalies didn't wear masks. But on November 1st, 1959, in a game against the Rangers team featuring Jimmy Bartlett, Montreal's Jacques Plante famously took a puck to the face. After that, goalies everywhere transformed themselves into 80s slasher movie villains. But not Andy Brown. Andy Brown played his last game in 1976 and was the last professional goalie to never wear a mask. He knew the dangers and the risks and was aware that a slap shot could kill him. But he said he didn't like them, and he wasn't afraid. He said, if you feel fear, no matter what you're doing in life, you won't succeed. Lots of people thought Andy Brown was nuts, but his refusal to wear a goalie mask never caused anyone to die from COVID-19. Andy Brown's father, Adam Brown, played left wing for the Detroit Red Wings in the 1940s and received an assist on the very first career NHL goal for an 18-year-old rookie appearing in his very first game by the name of Gordie Howe. In August 1968, violence broke out in Chicago between anti-war protesters and the police outside of the Democratic National Convention. The public saw on national television a stream of images of police brutality while the protesters shouted, "The whole world's watching! The whole world's watching!" Unfortunately for the anti-war movement, the silent majority of Americans who were watching at the time preferred law and order. They saw the counterculture as radical troublemakers and blamed the violence on the protesters while excusing the tactics of the police as justified. Bobby Seale of the Black Panthers, Yippie's Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and 5 other anti-war radical activists were labeled the Chicago Eight when they were arrested and charged with criminal conspiracy. Revolution was definitely in the air. The players in the American Hockey League were in open revolt against the owners. The players had already nixed the highly anticipated interleague series between the AHL and WHL champions because the owners refused to recognize their union. Now they were threatening to kill the season. On August 17, 1968, Players Association president and one of the new members of the Clippers, Jim Morrison, announced that the Players Association voted to boycott training camp and told the Baltimore Sun, "It won't be a strike since we're not a union. It's more like a rebellion." On August 21st, the Cesar Chavez of the AHL, Jim Morrison, and several of the other Clippers met with Clipper management to air their grievances. Discussions started off well after Bob Brinkworth explained that the biggest gripe was with the pension and that the players wanted a portion of any All-Star games and playoff ticket sales to go towards funding the pension plan. Team President Ray Embry said, "This is nothing that can't be worked out." Chairman of the board, Zanvil Krieger, said, "We either pay our boys properly or we get out of hockey." Everyone stopped singing Kumbaya after General Manager Terry Reardon said that the Clippers probably had the highest payroll in the league. Jimmy Bartlett, channeling his inner Eugene Debs, said that there were players in the league making as little as $3,500 a year and that Quebec and Rochester payrolls were higher than Baltimore's. This pissed off the team's owner, Krieger, who silenced Bartlett by screaming, "Quebec's not higher." Krieger was probably right with so many of Quebec's players joining Baltimore that season, but notice how the clever Harvard attorney Krieger didn't deny Bartlett's allegation about Rochester's payroll being higher than Baltimore's, or that the players in the AHL were earning less than the Western League's minimal salary. The press sympathized with the players since the AHL players made considerably less money compared to other professional athletes. Reardon claimed the team's average salary was about $9,000, which is worth about $80,000 in 2024 dollars. The AHL players' measly pension plan was controlled by the owners and not the players, and was only 1 year old, so it was basically worthless, and the players wanted health care for their families. 5 days later, the Beatles released the single Revolution. The flip side to Hey Jude didn't actually advocate for revolution. Lennon instead rejected political violence, warned of fear-mongering extremists, and reminded people to calm down because it's going to be all right. On September 28th, the Players Association and ownership reached an agreement, and the season was saved. Because Aldo was now coach, the team needed a new captain, and Jim Morrison was the obvious choice. Bartlett had been bedridden with the flu for 3 days when the season began. On October 8, 1968, the Baltimore Clippers beat the Cleveland Barons 3-1 in the season opener. Because Bartlett wasn't skating well due to his illness, Guidolin benched Bartlett in the second period for the rookie Dave Rochefort. Bartlett played like a ball of fire after returning to the game in the third period. Although America was badly divided during the stormy 1960s, everyone took pride in the success of our space program. But after the Apollo 1 tragedy killed 3 astronauts in a launch pad fire in January 1967, NASA hadn't launched anyone else into space. Time was running out to fulfill Kennedy's promise to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade, but NASA was determined to honor his memory. On October 11, 1968, a proud nation watched original Mercury 7 astronaut Wally Schirra command Apollo 7 in the first manned flight of the Apollo program. On the same day as the Apollo 7 launch, the Clippers played the Hershey Bears. Although Jimmy was still sick with the flu, he was determined not to get benched again. During the game, Bartlett was hacking so badly on the bench that a sympathetic fan sent down a box of cough drops for him. Trailing 2-0, headed into the third period, Aldo decided to switch up the lines and put Bartlett and Jean-Marie Cossette on a line centered by Willie Marshall. According to the press, by the aggressive way Bartlett dug pucks out of the corners and fed them to Marshall, nobody would have guessed that he was still sick. Bartlett fed the puck to Marshall for the Clippers' first goal of the night, and Cunningham then tied the game at 2. According to the Baltimore Sun, Bartlett, playing one of his finest games ever in a Clipper uniform, scored on a backhander what he thought was the game winner less than a minute after that. And Clipper defenseman Bill Spear added another goal to give the Clippers a 4-2 lead. But Hershey came roaring back and tied the game with a pair of goals of their own. With only a minute and a half left on the clock, and with Bartlett and Cossette doing the tough work of digging the puck out of the corners, Bartlett fed the puck out front to Willie Marshall, who scored the game winner in the Clippers' 5-4 victory. Even though he was still sick as a dog, Jimmy also scored the next night in the Clippers' 5-3 loss in Hershey. The Baltimore Clippers had a legendary trainer named Ray Embro, who had the nickname Gump, just like the Hall of Fame starting goalie for the 1968 Montreal Canadiens, Gump Worsley, who had played 10 years earlier on the New York Rangers with Jimmy Bartlett. In 1962, Gumpy once had to strap on the pads just like Worsley and appeared in a game as the Clippers' emergency backup goalie. Don Blackburn, yet another former star of the Quebec Aces, made his debut for the Clippers in their October 15th game against the Springfield Kings after being lent to the team by the Philadelphia Flyers. Blackburn would score 19 points in his 12-game stint in Baltimore before returning back to Philly. Clipper trainer Gump Embro was kicked out of the game and ordered into the dressing room. According to the linesman Bill Russell, the Clippers trainer called him a name using filthy language. When he issued a penalty and skated over to him on the bench, the two of them scuffled. But that's not what happened according to Embro. Gumpy said, "I didn't call him any name. He came up to me, and I hit him." Jimmy Bartlett was quite happy that Aldo Guidolin was named as the Clippers' new player coach. When Hall of Fame defenseman Fernie Flaman became the new player coach of the Providence Reds in 1961, Jimmy's friend and former teammate from the Bruins created the high-scoring B line of Baluch, Briand, and Bartlett, and Jimmy enjoyed the most productive stretch of his career. In 1955, Jimmy and Aldo Guidolin were both American League rookies on the Providence Reds team that won their Calder Cup championship, and they both played a dozen games that season for the New York Rangers when the pair was called up mid-season. Because Bartlett and Guidolin had played together for 4 seasons in Providence and 2 more in Baltimore, Jimmy was confident that he would once again score 30 goals playing on the top line now that his friend was at the helm. But that's not how it worked out. Bartlett wasn't happy that because he was still sick with a heavy chest cold, he was left home to recuperate while the Clippers went on a road trip to Rochester and Springfield. But it got even worse. Coach Guidolin announced that even after Bartlett fully recovers, that because of the additions to the roster of new forwards Hicks, Blackburn, and Rochefort, Clippers Duncan McDonald, Bobby Brinkworth, and Jimmy Bartlett would no longer have a spot on any of the team's three lines. Only two of the three would even dress for the games and would basically just ride the bench as spares. As a result, Bartlett's former apartment mate Duncan McDonald would only play 4 games for the Clippers in 1968. He would return to Canada the following year and would play senior hockey for 5 seasons before retiring. I'm not sure why Guidolin benched Bartlett, but I'm sure it wasn't personal. After the 1967 expansion, the independence of the American Hockey League was weakened, and it became more and more dependent on the NHL. The coaches in the American Hockey League knew that the NHL teams weren't lending the AHL players just for them to sit on the bench. But then again, Aldo may have genuinely believed that Father Time had caught up to Jimmy Bartlett and that it was time for him to hang up the skates. The press thought the benching was merely a motivation tactic as part of the coach's philosophy of mentally jogging his recalcitrance. However, on November 4, 1968, the Baltimore Sun reported that the Clippers were attempting to trade Bartlett to the San Diego Gulls of the Western League. The trade never occurred, to the disappointment of Ron Burgundy. On November 5, 1968, Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States by promising the nation law and order and by successfully implementing his Southern strategy, which realigned conservative Southern Democrats to the Republican Party.
Rocket to me?
Guidolin's benching of Bartlett did not escape the attention of the angry Baltimore fans or Bartlett himself. Jimmy sat on the bench without any ice time at all for 9 straight games. But after taking Bartlett's spot in the lineup, rookie Dave Rochefort only scored once. On November 12th, Guidolin finally allowed Bartlett on the ice for a few minutes when he churned up the ice against the Providence Reds like a suddenly released bulldog. On November 19, 1968, defenseman Jimmy Watson made his debut with the Baltimore Clippers in their game against the Springfield Kings. The previous year, Watson played the entire season as a teammate of Gordie Howe on the Detroit Red Wings. However, Detroit assigned the 24-year-old to their Central League team in Fort Worth to begin the new season before promoting him to Baltimore. My mom, Kelly Bartlett, knowing that Watson was a young single guy, fixed him up with one of her girlfriends from work. In the game, Guidolin pulled Bartlett and Brinkworth out of mothballs and actually gave them both a chance to play on regular lines in Baltimore's 9-7 win over Springfield. In a game in which both teams ignored defense, the 16 combined goals was the most combined goals ever scored in a Clippers game. According to the Baltimore Sun, Jimmy played brilliantly on a line with Bob Cunningham and Sandy McGregor, which accounted for 3 of the team's goals. Bartlett scored the first goal of the game at 2:34 of the first period, and it was described as the neatest goal of the night, when he was rebuffed at the left of the cage, then circled behind and shoved the puck past goalie Claude Hardy on the wraparound. New teammate Jimmy Watson got the assist. Bartlett had a 3-point night, and Brinkworth scored the game winner, substituting for Eddie McQueen on a line with Blackburn and Mortson. On December 12th, goalie Joe Boisvert was reactivated after his 3-month retirement to become Andy Brown's backup. 3 days later, Bartlett's third-period goal resulted in a 3-3 Clipper tie against the Buffalo Bisons. The game, though, ended in a bloodbath. With 2.5 minutes left to play, Baltimore's Jimmy Watson and Buffalo's Roger Picard dropped the gloves and started swinging. When former Clipper Ron Ingram grabbed Keke Mortson, he punched Ingram, cutting him badly over the right eye. After Morrison was sent to the dressing room, an infuriated Ingram attempted to follow him, which resulted in both benches clearing in an epic 10-minute battle royal. With the Buffalo fans screaming for Mortson's blood, the police were needed to escort the team to the bus after the game. With the Christmas holidays approaching, the Marshall, Cossette, and McGregor line was the hottest line in the American Hockey League, with Jean-Marie Cossette having a career year. On December 22, 1968, it was good news for Bartlett when his rookie replacement, Dave Rochefort, received shoulder surgery and would miss the next 10 games. Apollo 8 astronauts Frank Gorman and Jib Lovell became the first humans in history to ever leave the gravitational influence of the Earth and orbit another celestial body. On Christmas Eve, they orbited the moon for the first time and captured the breathtaking photograph of an Earthrise. The Pink Floydish mission to the dark side of the moon was the most covered spaceflight by the media since John Glenn rode the rocket. After a year filled with chaos and violence, the Apollo 8 mission provided the world with hope. The crew was recognized as Time's Person of the Year. On December 28th, first-period goals by Bartlett and Bob Breakworth gave Baltimore a 2-0 lead. After the Reds came back in the second period, the Clippers blew the game wide open in the third when Brinkworth and Bartlett both scored for a second time. Wayne Hicks made the score 7-2 with his own pair of third-period goals, with Bartlett receiving an assist. On New Year's Day, the Clippers lost 5-2 at home to the Quebec Aces. Playing for Quebec was former Clipper Bobby Rivard. In 1967, the speedy center averaged almost a point a game for Baltimore when he was called up to the NHL and played the final 27 games for the expansion Pittsburgh Penguins. At the end of the season, Pittsburgh basically rented Rivard to the Philadelphia Flyers, who lent him back to the AHL team that he was with prior to the Clippers. After scoring only 3 times in 34 games with Quebec, Philly returned Rivard back to Pittsburgh, who immediately lent him back to the Baltimore Clippers. The 1968-69 Baltimore Colts completely dominated the National Football League and finished the season with a record of 13-1, outscoring their opponents 402 to 144. Quarterback Earl Morrall was the league's MVP, replacing the injured legend Johnny Unitas. Don Shula's Colts humiliated the Cleveland Browns 34-0 in the NFL championship game. Since the AFL was considered a much inferior football league at the time, the outcome of the Super Bowl was just a foregone conclusion, as the Baltimore Colts were already being celebrated as the greatest NFL team of all time. On January 12, 1969, the 19.5-point underdog New York Jets pulled off the biggest upset in professional football history, stunning the Baltimore Colts 16-7. Jets quarterback Broadway Joe Namath became a cultural icon after he had guaranteed victory in Super Bowl III. Now, being from Baltimore, I know, like everybody else, that if Unitas started the game, there's no way in hell the Colts could have lost. But the New York media loved the cocky and charismatic Namath with his flashy and flamboyant lifestyle that was a stark contrast to the more conservative image of the typical athletes of the time. Although he obviously never achieved anything close to the fame or stardom of Broadway Joe, the press basically described Jimmy Bartlett the same way 10 years earlier when Bartlett became the first New York Ranger to have his own fan club, when Namath was still going to high school in Beaver Creek, Pennsylvania. After Rochefort injured his shoulder and Blackburn rejoined the Philadelphia Flyers, Guidolin finally put Bartlett on a regular line, playing with Bob Cunningham and Wayne Hicks on the right wing. My mom, Kelly, took a road trip with some of her girlfriends to the home of the Bonhomme Carnival, Quebec City, to watch Jimmy play against the Aces. She was able to ride in a snowmobile, gaze at the world-famous ice sculptures, romance with Bartlett at the Chateau Frontenac, and basically enjoy the joie de vivre of the provincial capital. On January 14, 1969, she was able to watch the Clippers play the Quebec Aces to a 4-4 tie. Jimmy began the game in his usual spot on the bench, with Rivard taking Jimmy's spot at left wing on his line with Cunningham and Hicks. But halfway through the game, Guidolin replaced Cunningham with Bartlett on the line, with Hicks now centered by Rivard. As usual, Jimmy got the headline. According to The Sun, Jim Bartlett burst out of the doghouse to score 2 goals, and the amazing Clippers extended their unbeaten streak to 5. Bartlett, who had been benched off and on all season by coach Aldo Guidolin, broke a 2-2 and a 3-3 tie, but the Clippers couldn't hold the lead, despite Gilles Boisvert's strong work in the net. Guidolin was unimpressed with Bartlett's performance. He said, "He didn't play exceptionally well. He was just in the right place at the right time." On January 22nd, Bartlett picked up a 5-minute major for fighting Cleveland Barons defenseman Bill Needham, after Needham had just been honored in a pregame ceremony for winning the Eddie Shore Award as the league's best defenseman. The next day, as soon as the Clippers got off the plane from the return flight home, Guidolin ordered the team to practice. Bartlett was pissed and said to Aldo, "You want me to go out today?" Bartlett's left knee was puffy from an injury after the Cleveland game. After he started to rant on about how he had never been hurt in 14 years as a pro, and now that he was, nobody believed him, and... "Jim," Aldo said, cutting him off gently, "let Gump look at your knee, and if it looks bad to him, just take a treatment." After Jimmy left with the trainer, Guidolin then explained to the team that he simply wanted a 30-minute skate so Andy Brown could take a few shots to make sure he wasn't rusty, since Boisvert had lately been playing in net. After the team's leading scorer, Jean-Marie Cossette, suffered an ankle injury, Jimmy was given the chance to play on the Clippers' top line with Willie Marshall and Sandy McGregor in Baltimore's January 29th 7-3 rout against the Springfield Kings. Bartlett scored the game's first goal in the first minute and 25 seconds after taking a neat feed from Jim Morrison, skated in alone, and then easily beat King goalie Don McLeod with a high, hard backhander. After losing the game in Cleveland, the Clippers attempted to fly back home to Baltimore. However, the plane's fuel booster pump malfunctioned after takeoff, and the plane had to return back to Cleveland for the night to make repairs. On February 1st, it took the Clippers 6 hours to fly back to Baltimore the next day, where they were scheduled to play the Providence Reds that night. Before the game, Bartlett predicted that, "We're going to bomb Providence about 7-1. Why? Every time something like this happens to a team, it has a great game." He said the same thing happened when he played for Providence. Returning from his shoulder injury, Rochefort and Bartlett alternated shifts in Cossette's spot on the Marshall line. Jimmy's skills at prognostication was damn impressive, and the team did even better than Bartlett predicted, with Gilles Boisvert shutting Providence out 7-0. Jean-Marie Cossette returned from his injury and resumed the spot on the top line with Willie Marshall in the Clippers' February 7th game against the Hershey Bears. Earlier in the season, Bartlett thought he might be traded. He thought of himself as just a spare part, and with a good reason. He wasn't playing regularly and actually wasn't even allowed to dress for a couple of games. According to the Baltimore Sun, Bartlett has a crowd-pleasing technique of barreling around the rink, crashing into people, forcing the play, and making scintillating solo dashes up ice. The rap seems to be that he doesn't do it often enough, that there's a certain lack of consistency in his play. Although he was used as a spare for much of the season, Bartlett was still seen as a key to the Clippers' rise in the standings, and the way Bartlett goes was so important to the club that coach Aldo Guidolin had him in for a special talk before the game. Aldo shifted Bartlett from Willie Marshall's line to a new line centered by Bobby Rivard. The Clippers took a 2-0 lead over the Hershey Bears after 2 first-period goals by new line mates Rivard and Bartlett, and never looked back, easily defeating Hershey 7-4 and moving Baltimore into second place in the standings. Jimmy also picked up a couple of assists on second-period goals by Wayne Hicks and Keke Mortson. Although the light was still glowing in Bartlett's eyes as he dressed after the game, he was actually able to see beyond the Bartlett world and told Al Fisher of the Baltimore Sun, "I'm sure we can keep it up. We're going good now with 3 lines that can score and the goaltending straightened out." Of course, Jimmy didn't completely ignore Bartlett world. After the game, Bartlett told George Taylor of the Baltimore News-American, "My only disappointment is that I didn't score more, and I would have if I had not been trying so hard. But after getting assigned to a regular line for the first time, I was over-anxious. I wanted to prove to myself and to the fans that I'm not through." On February 10th, the game against Providence was canceled due to power failure. On that same day, Clipper center Bob Cunningham was lent to the Western League for the balance of the season in exchange for Andre Pronovost. In 1960, Pronovost had been a teammate of Bartlett's on the Boston Bruins. In 1962, Pronovost was traded to Detroit, where he was a teammate of Gordie Howe for 2 years. He was demoted to Memphis in the Central League, where he spent a couple of seasons before he was poached by Minnesota in the 1967 expansion draft. On February 11th, 20-year-old defenseman Jerry Hart, with his very first professional goal, scored the Clippers' 10th goal of the game at 6:39 of the third period, tying the team's record for goals in a game in the Clippers' blowout win against the Quebec Aces. With the hometown fans screaming for the record breaker, Bartlett came through at 15-11 with the record-breaking goal in the Clippers' 11-2 shellacking of Quebec. On February 16th, the Amerks shut out the Clippers 2-0 in Rochester behind the brilliant goaltending of Al Smith. The Clippers played well enough to win with numerous scoring chances, but Smith was always there to make the stop. He had Jimmy Bartlett talking to himself after thwarting the Clipper left winger 3 times on shots of less than 5 feet. Smith was spectacular on one particular power play when he blocked Bartlett's backhander from just outside the crease. Jimmy had enough time to pick up the puck and hand it to Smith if he wanted to. A fight between Bartlett and Rochester defenseman Jack Chipchase near the end of the second period caused both benches to clear and everybody joined in the mayhem. On February 25th, Bartlett scored the game winner when he deflected Rivard's long shot from the point past Marcel Paillet of the Providence Reds. Earlier in the game, Bartlett got the best of the Reds' Ray Clearwater in a brief skirmish. Both players were assessed roughing minors, but Providence was giving a power play when Jimmy was slapped with an additional 2 minutes for high sticking. Player coach Aldo Guidolin was giving a 10-minute misconduct after he berated the referee for the unjust persecution of Bartlett. The Clippers' penalty killers prevented Providence from even getting off a shot during the power play as Gilles Boisvert shut out Providence 2-0. It was a good thing that they coaxed Boisvert out of retirement. Less than a week later, Andy Brown would break his collarbone, ending his season. As a result, the Clippers were forced to call up 34-year-old goalie Marv Edwards from the Amarillo Wranglers. Although Aldo came to Bartlett's defense in the game against Providence, he was still limiting Jimmy's ice time, alternating him with Andre Pronovost on a line with Rivard and Wayne Hicks. Hockey players were paid not only to score goals, but also to commit violence. Fighting in hockey has always been governed by a code of honor that exists outside of the official rulebook. The violence wasn't personal, it was just business. Kelly Bartlett was able to gain some insight into this unusual lifestyle that March when she became immersed in a bestseller that swept the nation that spring that had absolutely nothing at all to do with ice hockey. Mario Puzo's The Godfather. On March 16th, Aldo started Bartlett instead of Pronovo, even though Jimmy missed the warm-ups because he thought the afternoon game was at 2:30 instead of 2 o'clock. Bobby Rivard had the hat trick, and Jimmy Bartlett and Wayne Hicks each had a pair of goals as the line of Rivard, Bartlett, and Hicks combined for an incredible 7 goals in the Clippers' 10-1 blowout over the Cleveland Barons. Rivard scored his 3rd goal at 7:34 of the second period, when Jimmy somehow took a pass from Rivard immediately off the faceoff and somehow fired it past stunned goaltender Ernie Wakely after only a mere 4 seconds had ticked off the clock at 7:38. Bartlett and Rivard set a new American Hockey League record for fastest 2 goals scored by a single team. Bartlett, of course, also has the individual record when he scored 2 goals in 5 seconds against Rochester on January 5, 1958, a record that still has never been broken. After the game, Guidolin told the press that Bartlett's performance did not change anything. Whether he would start or just sit on the bench would be a day-to-day decision. The Rivard, Bartlett, and Hicks line was the hottest line on the team, despite the fact that Jimmy was still only a part-time reformer. Jimmy scored a power play goal in the Clippers' next game when they beat the Rochester Americans 7-2. Although the goal judge failed to light the lamp, the referee awarded the goal to Bartlett after ruling goalie Al Smith failed to cover up until after the puck had already passed over the goal line. In their next game, newly called-up goalie Marv Edwards shut out the Cleveland Barons 3-0. The Baltimore Sun reported that Bartlett, who had seen only part-time duty with the Clippers, made good his boast that he would score 20 or more goals as he hit the 20 mark on the button with his 3rd period score. 2 days later, on March 25th, the Clippers defeated the Springfield Kings in a tough, exciting matchup for their 3rd straight win. With the score tied at 3, Wayne Hicks fired a high shot at the goal. Bartlett somehow batted and deflected the puck midair as he went crashing into the goalie, Claude Hardy, in the crease, with the puck crossing over the goal line for the game winner. The Springfield players were infuriated, claiming that Bartlett committed goaltender interference. The referee, however, agreed that Bartlett was cross-checked into the net, so the controversial goal was allowed. In the Clippers' next game, the red-hot Jimmy Bartlett scored again in Baltimore's 3-3 tie with the Cleveland Barons. In the 3rd period, Bartlett was on a breakaway when a hook from behind foiled his attempt to score the game winner. On March 30th, the Clippers shut out the Providence Reds 3-0 with another dominant performance in the net by new goalie Marv Edwards. Unfortunately, Wayne Hicks ended the season when he broke his leg while crashing into the boards. Bartlett, a former Red, who loved tormenting his former employers, scored his first goal after he deked around defenseman Mo Mantha before firing a 10-footer past Paille. Jimmy scored again in the third period after taking a perfect pass from Bobby Rivard on a 2-on-1 breakaway. Bartlett had scored 8 goals in his last 8 games. On April 2nd, the second-place Clippers were scheduled to play the first-place Hershey Bears. The Bears had the league's top 2 leading scorers, Jeannot Gilbert and Michel Harvey. Gilbert led the league with 100 points and was a former teammate of Bartlett on the 1964 Providence Reds. In 1968, Michel Harvey led the Bears with 41 goals and was named the first-team All-Star. Harvey played for the Quebec Aces from 1959 until 1962, where he twice scored 20 goals and would score more than 20 goals in 6 of the 7 seasons he would play for Hershey. Although he never played in the NHL in 1972, Michel Harvey would play 40 games for the Quebec Nordiques of the World Hockey Association. Harvey's teammate, winger Roger DeJordy, scored 25 goals in 1968 and also never played in the NHL. After spending 4 years playing for the Edmonton Flyers of the Western League, Roger would spend his entire AHL career with Hershey from 1962 until 1970 and ranks 5th in club history in career goals and is tied for 7th in points. In 1966, Roger DeJordy became the first Bear to ever score 50 goals in a season. When Roger was playing for Hershey, his brother Denny was a goalie for the Chicago Blackhawks. Before joining the Blackhawks, Denny DeJordy played 3 seasons for the Buffalo Bisons. In 1962, he was not only named the AHL's best goalie, he also was named the league's most valuable player. In 1966, teammates DeJordy and Glenn Hall shared the NHL's Vezina Trophy. After leaving Chicago, DeJordy played for the Kings, the Canadiens, and the Red Wings, primarily as a backup. He would finish his career in 1973 as the starting goalie for the Baltimore Clippers and was named the second-team All-Star. Goalie Andre Gill played for the Hershey Bears from 1962 until 1972. He won the Hap Holmes Award as the AHL's top goaltender after the 1966-67 season. Like Michel Harvey, Gill would jump to World Hockey in 1972, playing for the Chicago Cougars. His only stint in the NHL occurred in 1967 when he played 5 games for the Boston Bruins as a replacement for the injured Jerry Cheevers. With leading scorers Hicks and Cossette both out with injuries, the first-place Hershey Bears defeated the second-place Baltimore Clippers 4-2. However, in the third period, Zaine McGregor became the first Clipper ever to score 40 goals, breaking Doug Robinson's team record. Just like the Baltimore Colts, the Baltimore Bullets basketball team finished with the best record in the NBA and were the favorites to win the league championship. The team was led by Hall of Famers Gus Johnson and Earl the Pearl Monroe. Kevin Lockery, Jimmy's friend and teammate on the Brewers All-Star softball team, averaged 22 points a game, but the team's success was due to the brilliant play of their 22-year-old rookie center, future Hall of Famer Wes Unseld. Because the Clippers and the Bullets both played at the Baltimore Civic Center, the Clippers would watch the Bullets play, and the Bullets would attend the hockey games. The shy rookie from Louisville used to sit with my mom and the other hockey wives at the Clipper games. Kelly Bartlett worked for the Social Security Administration, which had its national headquarters in Baltimore County. After playing matchmaker for Jimmy Watson, she unsuccessfully attempted to find a nice girl for her friend, Wesley, as she called him, but her African-American friends at work were either married or too short for the NBA center. Eventually, Wes would marry his college sweetheart and would live in Baltimore the rest of his life, opening a private school with his wife. Averaging 18.2 rebounds per game, Wes Unseld was not only named the Rookie of the Year, he was also named the league's most valuable player. In the first round of the NBA playoffs, the Bullets played the third-place New York Knicks. Just like the New York Jets, the New York Knicks stunned the favorite Baltimore team. On the same day that Zaine McGregor scored his 40th goal for the Clippers, the Baltimore Bullets were eliminated from the playoffs after being swept in 4 games by New York. 2 days later, Dave Rochefort broke his hand. He would never play again for the Baltimore Clippers. He had scored only 2 goals in 46 games. In the final game of the season, the Clippers were trailing Springfield 3-1 in the third period. Although Baltimore tied it up after Bartlett and Rivard scored and assisted on each other's goals, the Kings scored a couple of power play goals to beat the Clippers 5-3. Although the season ended with a loss, the Clippers finished in second place and were going to the playoffs. Willie Marshall was fourth in the league in scoring and was the Clippers' leading scorer once again. At left wing, Jean-Marie Cossette had the best season of his career and finished sixth in the league in scoring despite missing 10 games. The former Quebec Aces all had great years. Wayne Hicks was named the Clippers MVP after scoring 33 goals and finishing tied for third on the team with scoring with Keke Mortson, who scored 20 goals of his own and finished fifth in the league in both assists and in penalty minutes. Defenseman Jim Morrison was named the second-team All-Star for the third consecutive year. Wayne Hicks and Jean-Marie Cossette were also named second-team All-Stars. Most impressive of all, though, was the Silver Fox, Zaine McGregor, who netted an incredible 44 goals, which was second in the American Hockey League behind Buffalo's Guy Trottier. And despite all the benchings and limited ice time, Jimmy Bartlett was somehow able to still score 25 goals. When Jimmy played in the NHL, he was called Rocky because he threw punches like Rocky Marciano. But once he was traded to Baltimore, he became known as Black Bart. In the film The Princess Bride, the hero Wesley told Buttercup that he had assumed the identity of the mythical Dread Pirate Roberts. The Dread Pirate Roberts was based on one of the most successful and notorious pirates of the 18th century named Bartholomew Roberts, who was eventually given the moniker Black Bart. Jimmy wasn't nicknamed Black Bart in honor of this Welsh pirate, but instead after the famous stage bandit of the Old West. Black Bart's real name was Charles Bowles. Holding a shotgun, he made a menacing impression, dressed in a long duster coat and wearing a bowler hat, using a flour sack with holes cut for his eyes as a mask. Bowles' image was intentionally designed to cause fear and was directly based on a fictitious outlaw in a dime store novel named Black Bart that he once read. Bowles was famous for writing witty poems that he used to leave at the scene of the crime, which he signed Black Bart. Charles Bowles was known as a gentleman bandit because he was extremely polite to his victims and he never used profanity. He never fired a shot because he hated violence, and he was absolutely terrified of horses. In other words, Jimmy Bartlett was nothing like the real Black Bart. Instead, Jimmy thought of himself as being more like a gunfighter. He would wear his black cowboy hat and love playing the villain on the road. Bartlett's frequent benchings by Guidolin was actually consistent with this persona. It seemed like whenever Baltimore needed a big goal, they would summon the old gunslinger off the bench and he would come riding into town to save the day before disappearing again into the night. In the first round of the playoffs, although the Clippers had home ice advantage in a best-of-5 series against the Providence Reds, the team was seriously disadvantaged because team MVP Wayne Hicks was sidelined with a broken leg. Because of the death of his mother, Coach Aldo Guidolin was also unavailable, so Terry Reardon took up coaching duties for Game 1. Jimmy openly admitted that since he played 8 seasons for Providence, he played harder and gave extra effort whenever he played against his old team. Because of this, Jimmy's Baltimore teammates dubbed him the Mayor of Providence. Prior to the first game on April 9th, Nick Polano told the press, "You know, Jimmy Bartlett has as good of moves as any winger in the league, and he's a real spark for this club." After the game, the Baltimore Sun called Polano a prophet. Playing on a line with Bobby Rivard, Bartlett lashed out at the Reds with every ounce of energy that his 36-year-old carcass could exert, and had 6 shots in the first period alone, including the all-important first goal of the game. With the Clippers trailing 2-1 in the second period, Morrison tied the score after the Reds' Keller and Meisner were involved in a brawl with Bartlett and John Arbour. And Willie Marshall had the game winner in the third period. Morrison scored again for good measure in Baltimore's 4-2 win in Game 1 over the Providence Reds. After the game, the cocky Bartlett said he was disappointed because he should have scored 3 goals in the first period. Baltimore Sun called Black Bart the people's choice. Black Bart is a fighter. Black Bart is the fellow the plain Joe in the stands can identify with. Jimmy Bartlett's the people's choice. When Bart charges up the ice with the puck, you can really feel that you're out there on the ice, one fan remarked. And when he scores, you want to jump up with him and wave a stick in the air. And when he misses and slumps against the boards, everybody in the place can feel it. Maybe he is just too emotional to be a great hockey player, the fan added. Aldo Guidolin was back at the helm for Game 2. Bartlett said before the game that Baltimore needed to win both of its home games in order to win the series. Unfortunately, Providence scored 3 goals in the first period and chased starting goalie Marv Edwards from the net in the Reds' 5-1 win over the Clippers at the Civic Center. Bad luck and great goaltending by Marcel Paillet gave the Reds a 4-1 win in Game 3 and a 5-1 win in Game 4. After winning their first game, the Clippers were embarrassed by dropping 3 in a row while being outscored 14-3 as they were bounced out of the playoffs. After the Clippers' quick elimination in the playoffs against the Reds, Aldo was removed as head coach, retired as a player, and instead became a scout for Baltimore. During his lengthy career, the highly respected Guidolin was twice named a first-team AHL All-Star and is the all-time leading Clipper in penalty minutes. Guidolin wasn't the only defenseman that the Clippers lost. The team also lost their captain and all-star defenseman Jim Morrison to the NHL. The Pittsburgh Penguins were in desperate need for an experienced puck-moving defenseman. But because Morrison was owned by the Clippers and not the Penguins, Pittsburgh not only had to pay cash to the Clippers for the rights of Morrison, but the crafty Reardon was also able to convince them to throw in the rights to Bobby Rivard as well. Because Rivard would now be owned outright by Baltimore, there would be no more call-ups to Pittsburgh. Because of this deal, after playing 9 seasons in the American Hockey League, Jim Morrison finally got a chance to return to the NHL in 1969 at the ripe old age of 37, where he would play 2 full seasons for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Wayne Hicks replaced Morrison as the Clippers' new captain. Clipper defenseman John Arbour was traded away by Pittsburgh to the Vancouver Canucks of the Western League. When the Canucks joined the NHL, Arbour stayed with the club until he was traded to the St. Louis Blues, joining the Plager brothers. In 1972, Arbour jumped to the World Hockey Association, where he played 7 seasons, mostly with the Minnesota Fighting Saints. The Detroit Red Wings assigned defenseman Jimmy Watson to play the 1969 season with the Cleveland Barons. Watson was poached by the Buffalo Sabres in the draft when the NHL expanded in 1970. After playing 2 seasons in Buffalo, Watson also jumped to World Hockey, where he played for 4 more years. And Andre Pronovost would score 50 goals in 1969 with the semi-pro Muskegon Mohawks of the International League. According to the new NHL rules, each Major League team was required to have a developmental club. Developmental clubs were required to play 9 players owned by the NHL, 7 of which must be younger than 23, with the other 2 being no older than 26. The teams in the low-level Central Hockey League were all developmental teams that were owned by the NHL. The American Hockey League, on the other hand, was an independent league that owned most of its own players, even though the NHL would lend the team some players. During the offseason, the Clippers signed a new agreement with the Pittsburgh Penguins. According to General Manager Terry Reardon, "We have signed an agreement with the Penguins that will give us X numbers of players. This does not make us a developmental club." The Houston Apollos was the Montreal Canadiens' developmental league in the Central League. However, because of poor attendance, the team relocated and joined the American Hockey League as the Montreal Voyageurs for the 1969-1970 season. Baltimore was moved from the Eastern to the Western Division to make room for Montreal. It was clear that the AHL was beginning to lose its independence. During summer of 1969, the hockey world was once again consumed with talks of expansion. The NHL was adding 2 teams for the 1970 season. Vancouver was assured a berth. The 2 cities in competition for the other spot were AHL rivals Buffalo and Baltimore. As always, the Civic Center was a problem. Baltimore knew that to obtain a team, the Civic Center would have to remodel and add seats. But because of the many broken promises made by the NHL in the past, there was no way Baltimore was going to spend money to make these improvements before awarding the city an NHL franchise. However, since Baltimore was the largest city in the country without an NHL team and had a larger TV market and a larger arena than Buffalo did, it seemed likely that the Clippers would finally be leaving the AHL for the NHL. In July 1969, Terry Reardon sold Nick Polano to the Providence Reds, where the defenseman would play for 5 seasons. After retiring as a player, Nick Polano would twice be named the Coach of the Year for the Eastern League's Erie Blades. After a season with the Buffalo Sabres as Scotty Bowman's assistant coach, in 1982 Polano became the head coach of the Detroit Red Wings for the next 3 years, where he was a young Steve Yzerman's first NHL coach. Although it would be impossible to imagine an NHL today without Russian players like Ovechkin or Kucherov, or Czech greats like Jagr or Hasek, during the Cold War, politics prevented many of the world's greatest players from communist countries from playing in the NHL. After becoming assistant general manager of the Red Wings, Polano scouted winger Peter Klima during the 1983 World Championships as a member of the Czechoslovakian team and convinced the team to pick him in that year's draft. In a scene right out of a spy novel, 2 years later when the Czech team was playing in West Germany, Peter Klima snuck away from the team's hotel where he met Polano, and the two of them hid out in the woods while the United States Attorney General Edwin Meese granted him political asylum and accompanied him to America, where he became the first communist hockey player ever to defect on September 22, 1985. Polano also helped Detroit obtain Russian greats Slava Kozlov, Vladimir Konstantinov, and future Hall of Famer Sergei Fedorov, forever changing the league and laying the foundation for one of the greatest hockey teams in history. Nobody was surprised when the emergency backup goalie Joe Boisvert announced his retirement once again. However, in July, original Clipper Sandy McGregor shocked everyone when he announced his retirement from hockey at the age of 30, after scoring a team record 44 goals when he accepted a job offer to be the Eastern sales manager for the Eastern Stainless Steel Company. 5 days after McGregor called it quits, my mom and dad were gathered around a television set while walking on the boardwalk in Ocean City, Maryland, where they watched the most monumental accomplishment in the history of mankind as a low-key 39-year-old Midwesterner named Neil Armstrong took one small step. After making his greatest achievement, Armstrong rejected the spotlight and simply headed back to his farm in Ohio and returned to a normal life, sort of like selling stainless steel after scoring 44 goals. On August 8, 1969, 8.5 months pregnant Hollywood starlet Sharon Tate and 4 others were brutally murdered in Los Angeles by the Manson family. On the next night, the deranged cult broke into the home of the LaBiancas and hacked the couple up with a machete, writing "Death to Pigs" on the wall and "Helter-Skelter" on the refrigerator door with the blood of the victims. The charismatic but insane cult leader, Charles Manson, carefully brainwashed, controlled, and manipulated his followers, who worshipped him as the Messiah, into committing the most horrific atrocities in his name. He indoctrinated his young followers into believing that he was destined to rule the survivors of an apocalyptic race war that was prophesied by the Beatles on the White Album. Although Manson never personally murdered any of his victims and never explicitly commanded his worshippers to kill anyone, he was nevertheless successfully convicted of all 7 murders by prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi. When Manson told his cult, "Now is the time for helter-skelter," they knew that the time for standing back and standing by was over. He didn't need to tell them to kill or even to fight like hell. His demented followers knew exactly what Manson wanted. Bob Brinkworth bought a house in Detroit during the off-season, and he also decided to retire after having his best season. After sitting out a year, Brinkworth would put the skates back on in 1970 for the Port Huron Flags of the International Hockey League, where he played for 4 seasons. In 2004, Brinkworth would become the head coach for the Florida Gulf Coast University's hockey squad, where he would coach for the next 15 seasons and would win the American Collegiate Hockey Association Division II championship. Maybe McGregor and Brinkworth saw the writing on the wall and thought it was inevitable that Baltimore would become a developmental club and that many veteran players would soon be standing in the unemployment line. Less than a week after the Manson murders, 400,000 young people frolicked in the mud on Max Yasgur's New York dairy farm for a music festival that was officially billed as an Aquarian Exposition, 3 days of peace and music. Today, it is referred to more commonly as just Woodstock, and it was the pinnacle moment of the counterculture. Ironically, only about 10% of the crowd was still there by the time Jimi Hendrix played the iconic Star-Spangled Banner. The players invited to the training camp that were owned by the Clippers were Jimmy Bartlett, Willie Marshall, Jean-Marie Cossette, Eddie McQueen, Bobby Rivard, Bob Cunningham, Wally Chevrier, and Andy Brown. 32-year-old captain Wayne Hicks was still on loan from the Penguins. Terry also invited to camp a young prospect who had scored 24 goals the year before, playing for the Clinton Comets of the Eastern League. 23-year-old Rod Zaine was not the typical blue-collar type of hockey player. The playmaking center instead read poetry and was only 5 credits short of a bachelor's degree in political science when Terry Reardon brought him to Baltimore. According to Zaine, I have a hard time expressing myself, and I marvel at the way Chaucer felt about life and was able to express himself. It's doubtful that many of the other players on the Clippers were into the Canterbury Tales. Rod Zaine also dressed in the mod style of the late 60s. He had long hair, dressed in a fur coat like Joe Namath, and wore orange bell-bottoms. After he met Kelly, who was 11 years younger, Bartlett started to grow his hair long and sport sideburns. Once Jimmy allowed Kelly to remake his entire wardrobe, Bartlett was able to give Zaine some competition as the team's hippest dresser.
And now for something completely different.
Shortly before the season began, the Baltimore Clippers made the shocking announcement that they would, in fact, operate as a developmental team for the Pittsburgh Penguins for the 1968-69 season. Not counting goalies, this agreement required the Clippers to play 7 players younger than 24 and 2 others younger than 26. Unfortunately, the only skater owned by the Clippers who was younger than 26 was Rod Zaine. In other words, the older Clippers were facing the axe. Although Terry Reardon admitted that under the new agreement, the Clippers would not be dressing their 18 best players each night, he believed that in the long run it would be in the team's best interest because they would have the right to buy some of Pittsburgh's young players. On September 11th, 2 days before the opening of training camp, the Clippers finally named their new coach to replace Aldo Guidolin, Rudy Migay. After coaching the Pittsburgh Penguins Central League Farm Club, the Amarillo Wranglers, in 1968, Reardon explained that Rudy is well known for his ability to develop young players, and that is what he will essentially be working with in our agreement with the Penguins. In fact, it was because of this skill with young players that Pittsburgh recommended Migay. The 40-year-old Migay played from 1948 until 1960. It was strange that Migay's and Bartlett's careers never really crossed paths before he joined the Clippers, but Jimmy just happened to be in the AHL when Rudy was in the NHL playing for the Maple Leafs, and Jimmy was in the NHL when Rudy was in the AHL playing for the Pittsburgh Hornets and Rochester Americans. With the Clippers now completely committed to youth, Pittsburgh sent their new developmental team plenty of young players. In 1968, the 24-year-old Craig Cameron scored 11 goals playing 72 games at right wing for the St. Louis Blues. He was lent to Baltimore following a postseason trade with Pittsburgh along with George Swarbrick, who had played right wing for Team Canada in the 1964 Olympics. Swarby scored 20 goals in each of the next 3 years for the San Francisco Seals of the Western League, but only 13 goals in 1967 when the Seals jumped to the NHL. In the middle of the 1968-69 season, Swarbrick was part of a deal that sent the hard-hitting forward to Pittsburgh in a trade involving Gene Ubriaco. The Penguins also lent the Clippers their top young prospect, the 20-year-old center Rick Kessell. Kessell was drafted 15th overall in the 1969 entry draft after leading the Oshawa Generals in scoring while playing junior hockey. Pittsburgh also sent the Clippers a bunch of rookies who all played the previous year for coach Rudy Migay and the Amarillo Wranglers in the Central Hockey League. 23-year-old left winger Larry Billows, who scored 31 goals and led Amarillo in scoring. 21-year-old right winger Ron Snell, who lit the lamp 26 times. 21-year-old center Garry Swain, who also scored 20 goals. 24-year-old defenseman Jean-Guy Lagace, who previously was a second-team All-Star when he won the IHL championship with the 67-68 Muskegon Mohawks before he joined the Penguins organization. And 22-year-old defenseman Doug Barrie. After Doug got sick of being bullied as a kid growing up in Edmonton, he took up boxing lessons at the YMCA. Because of this, according to coach Rudy Migay, he never saw Barrie ever lose a fight. which quickly made him a fan favorite in Baltimore. And making his professional debut with the Clippers was Pittsburgh's 4th-round pick in the 1969 NHL amateur draft, Yvon Labre. The Penguins sent Labre straight to Baltimore after playing juniors for the Toronto Marlboros, where he was a teammate of future Hall of Famer Brad Park. The 19-year-old Labre would himself develop into a hard-nosed, defensive defenseman. As a result of the new agreement, when the Clippers' new season began on October 10th, veteran Clippers Wally Chevrier, Eddie McQueen, and Bob Cunningham all remained in street clothes. So was Keke Mortson, who predicted that he would probably be traded, and he wished the team would just hurry up and just get on with it. His wife was 5 months pregnant, and he was sleeping in a sleeping bag on the floor in Jean-Marie Cossette's apartment. Although he described Baltimore as one of the class towns of the AHL, he felt that this new agreement would make Baltimore minor league. 38-year-old Willie Marshall was also sidelined because of a wrist surgery, which delayed his pursuit of Fred Glover's AHL records for career goals, assists, and points. Marshall complained the agreement isn't fair to anyone, not even to these kids. Some of them are being brought up before they are ready. They tried the system in the Central League and it ruined that league. I hate to see them start on this league. Bob Cunningham, who had been lent to the Western League during the previous season, attended training camp expecting to be back on the Clippers squad. Discouraged, he was sick of waiting around in limbo, so he eventually bolted back to the Western League's Denver Spurs, where he played 22 games in his final season as a pro. Cunny would finish his career playing semi-pro senior hockey for 4 seasons back home in Ontario before calling it quits. Baltimore wasn't the only club in the AHL to transform into a developmental team that year. Veteran players on Providence, Springfield, Quebec, and Montreal were all in the same boat as those on the Clippers. At first, the teams attempted to skirt the rules and exploit loopholes to play more veterans. But after NHL president Clarence Campbell threatened to crack down with serious fines and penalties, the teams were forced to comply. As a result, even after he had recovered from his surgery, the legend himself, Willie Marshall, was forced to sit out 30 games. The Baltimore Sun reminded its readers how the Clipper management in the team's first year promised the fans an independent team with all players owned by Baltimore. Not only was he not playing, but unlike the other Clipper veterans, Jimmy Bartlett had yet to even sign a contract with the team. The Baltimore Sun described Bartlett as itchy, irritated, and frustrated, and that until he signs, Terry Reardon was refusing to allow Bartlett to even have his skates.
I'm almost embarrassed to tell you the club's offer of a raise, $150. I asked for $3,000, expecting to get $1,000. Now the club's up to $900, but Terry wants to dock me for the time I missed, so that knocks me down to about $380. Last week he says that I know where to reach him when I'm ready to sign.
Jimmy assumed he had the upper hand in the negotiations when the Clippers dropped their first 4 games, and it was Reardon who contacted Bartlett to set up a meeting at his office. But Reardon shocked Bartlett when he told him that he had some doubts as to whether Jimmy could even make the team.
Okay, I said, then trade me. The other clubs are full, he says, so I asked for a release, and he says, nah.
Bartlett completely folded and signed the contract at the meeting. Jimmy told the Sun afterwards,
after the conversation with Reardon, I wanted to get back into playing shape as fast as possible and show him how wrong he was about me not being able to make the team.
Terry Reardon had been dealing with Bartlett since 1955. The crafty general manager knew exactly how to push his buttons. With Bartlett, it was never really about money. It was all about ego. After dominating seasons, the Baltimore Colts and Bullets were upset by huge underdog New York teams. The 1969 Orioles were one of the most dominating teams in baseball history. They won 109 games, the same as the famous 61 Yankees with Mantle and Maris. They were heavy favorites in the Fall Classic against the New York Mets, who had their first winning season in the franchise's history that year. But on October 16, 1969, the Mets pulled off a miracle and defeated the Mighty Birds in the most stunning upset in baseball history. Having missed the first 7 games of the season, Jimmy made his debut for the 1-6 Clippers on October 28, 1969 in Baltimore's 4-1 win over Cleveland, but he only skated a few shifts to shake off the rust. However, the biggest hockey news that day had nothing to do with that game. Clipper owner Zanvil Krieger announced that the Clippers were choosing not to make a bid for the NHL expansion team. Krieger was upset that in 1967, the expansion fee was only $2 million, and now the NHL was asking for $6 million. According to Krieger, the terms of the new draft weren't as generous to the expansion clubs as the rules were in 1967, because each team would be allowed to protect 15 players and 2 goalies. Krieger predicted that if Buffalo was foolish enough to agree to those terms, it would be a financial disaster and the club would fold. Krieger said that the tripling in price was simply unacceptable and that he was certain that neither Vancouver nor Buffalo would be willing to pay that amount, and the NHL would have to then drop their price. Krieger thought that after a little bit of haggling and some more negotiations, the NHL and Baltimore would soon agree to more acceptable terms, and the Clippers would finally become a major league team. Unfortunately for Baltimore, Krieger was flat out wrong. Buffalo and Vancouver had no problem coughing up the $6 million expansion fee, and they both joined the NHL in 1970. Although neither team has won the Stanley Cup, they are both still going strong, and neither faced financial disaster. Today, the Buffalo Sabres and the Vancouver Canucks are each worth more than $1 billion. The Clippers next played the Rochester Americans at home on Halloween. Jimmy skated a few brief shifts in the win against Cleveland. He didn't feel in his best shape and he wanted to play again with Bobby Rivard and Wayne Hicks, the 2 guys who he clicked with at the end of the previous season. Instead, coach Rudy Migay decided to platoon Larry Billows and Bartlett at left wing on a line with rookies Rod Zaine and Ron Snell. In his very first shift on the ice, Jimmy assisted on a goal by Ron Snell. After the game, a jubilant Bartlett said while chomping on a long stogie,
Rudy was going to alternate Larry and I tonight, but after I got an assist my first time out, he left me in, and it paid off.
In the second period, Bartlett picked up a loose puck in his own zone, decked several of the Americans as he skated into Rochester territory, and then electrified the crowd in attendance by splitting the defense, pulling Rochester goalie Bob Whitten out of the net and sliding the puck in easily. After the game, Rod Zaine could only shake his head and said, "Bartlett is the slickest hockey player I've ever worked with." In the game, Bartlett and Ron Snell each had hat tricks, and Bartlett also had 3 assists for a 6-point game as the Bartlett, Zaine, and Snell line combined for 7 goals in Baltimore's 10-1 blowout over Rochester. A jubilant Bartlett playfully mocked his former coach Aldo Guidolin by predicting after the game that with 7 goals in one night,
I'm pretty sure the coach will want to take another look at us.
Bartlett did a much better job impressing his new coach than his previous one. Rudy Migay said after the game, "You don't break up a line that just scored 7 goals in one game. That Bartlett is a smart hockey player, and the 2 kids can't help but learn from him." The red-hot new line was given the nickname the 2 Kids and Daddy line and combined for 19 goals in their first 4 games together. Bobby Rivard wasn't happy with Bartlett's new line. Rivet wanted Bartlett to rejoin him on his line with Wayne Hicks. It must have felt good for Jimmy to be wanted again. On November 4th, Pittsburgh provided the Clippers with some goaltending help when they returned former Clipper goalie Joe Daly back to Baltimore. After spending the entire 1968 season playing for the Penguins, he would share goaltending duties with Andy Brown. It was not an acid flashback on November 10th, 1969 that caused mass sightings of a giant 8-foot-tall yellow bird. It was the premiere of the groundbreaking children's show Sesame Street. After dressing for only 4 games, Keke Mortson was proven right when he was sold to the Vancouver Canucks on November 14th. Although he would score only 5 goals that season with Vancouver, they still were able to win the Western Hockey League championship in their final season before jumping to the NHL. Hopefully he still had the sleeping bag he used at Cossette's because he would need it, spending the rest of his career as hockey's ultimate vagabond. In 1970, he played for Dallas in the Central League and for the Rochester Americans. In 1971, he was captain of the AHL Cincinnati Swords. In 72, he made his major league debut at the age of 38 when he jumped to the World Hockey Association and scored 13 goals for the Hockey Arrows. In 1973, he became the player coach of the Macon Whoopies in the Southern Hockey League and became the very first player to wear the number 99. When the team folded midseason, he returned back to the American League and became the captain of the relocated Jacksonville Barons. After sitting out a year, Keke played 12 games for the Buffalo Northmen of the short-lived North American Hockey League. And then after taking 2 more years off, the 43-year-old Keke Mortson finally finished his career in 1978 when he appeared in 2 playoff games for the Houston Aeros. On November 19, 1969, astronauts Pete Conrad and Alan Bean on the Apollo 12 mission became the 3rd and 4th people to ever walk on the moon. Unlike the stoic Neil Armstrong, Conrad's first words as he jumped off the lunar module ladder were, "Whoopee! Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me." While the energetic astronaut was having fun bouncing around the moon, the listless Clippers were trailing the Rochester Americans 1-0 after the first period. During the second period, while they were both sitting together in the penalty box after an on-ice shoving match, Rochester's Rene Robert made the mistake of punching Ron Snell in the jaw, who then unleashed a flurry of punches that knocked Robert to the floor of the penalty box. Right after that, Rick Barrie completely demolished Barrie Watson in a free-for-all. Rudy Migay was a big fan of fighting in hockey and remarked after the game that it's about time Barrie started pounding somebody. If things aren't going well and a fight breaks out, it livens up the whole team, especially if you win the fight. There's no doubt in my mind that those 2 fights got us skating. A minute after the fight, Willie Marshall tied the game when he scored his first goal of the season. Because Ron Zaine was injured and was out with a broken jaw, Coach Migay made Rivet happy when he put Bartlett back on the line with Rivard and Wayne Hicks. Shortly after Willie's goal, Bartlett, acting as a trailer on a play started by Hicks, came barreling into the goal to knife home Bobby Rivard's feet out from behind the Amerks net. On November 28th, the game was tied at 2 after Bartlett and Rivard both scored and assisted on each other's goals. With 4.5 minutes left of the game, Hershey's Gene Grattan received a 5-minute major for drawing blood after whacking Bartlett over the head with his stick. Snell scored the game winner on the ensuing power play in the game's final 2 minutes. On December 6, 1969, Meredith Hunter was stabbed to death at the Altamont Speedway in California by a member of the Hells Angels who was working security at the Rock Festival when he tried to rush the stage with a revolver during a set by the Rolling Stones. On that same night, Willie Marshall didn't need security to protect himself from his teammates after he was mobbed by them after he became only the 4th professional hockey player in history to ever score 500 goals, joining Gordie Howe, Maurice Richard, and Fred Glover in the Clippers' 2-2 tie against the Montreal Voyageurs. On December 11th, Jill Boisvert came out of retirement yet again to provide the Clippers with some goaltending depth. One of my earliest childhood memories was whenever the Clippers would go on a road trip, my dad used to serenade the family by singing, "I'm leaving on a jet plane, don't know when I'll be back again." On December 20th, 1969, Peter, Paul, and Mary's cover of the John Denver classic hit number 1 on the charts. Jimmy, of course, had no idea who sang the song. Ironically, Bartlett used to tell the story about the time the team once shared a chartered flight with the famous folk trio. I don't know the details, but Bartlett apparently had some sort of altercation with the group because of a guitar case when boarding the plane. He just told me that he almost nailed the fucking asshole. Which one, Peter or Paul? When he told me, the big fucking gunk, I realized he meant Paul Stookie. Only Bartlett could almost get into a fist fight with the iconic Peacenik. What the hell, Dad? Well, maybe the answer's blowing in the wind. Every Christmas, Jimmy would dress up as the Clippers Santa Claus and enjoyed giving presents to all the players' kids at the team's annual Christmas bash. Those happy kids would have needed a lifetime of therapy if they only knew how close Kris Kringle came to punching out the guy who sang Puff the Magic Dragon. Mike McMahon was a defenseman for the 1944 Stanley Cup winning Montreal Canadiens. His son, Mike Jr., was also a defenseman who played 40 games in 1963 for the Baltimore Clippers when he was owned by the New York Ranger organization. After playing in 1964 for the Rangers Central League Club in St. Paul, McMahon played the 65 season for the New York Rangers. He was then poached by the Montreal Canadiens in the interleague draft, who sent him to their affiliate in the Central League, the Houston Apollos, where he was named the league's best defenseman. McMahon was sold to the Minnesota North Stars when the NHL doubled in size in 1967. Although the immortal Bobby Orr would lead all NHL defensemen in scoring from 68 until 74, in 1967 it was Mike McMahon who outscored all other defensemen in the league. But after failing to score any goals in 44 games with Minnesota the following year, he was traded to the Blackhawks, who put him on waivers. In 1969, he was picked up off of waivers by Detroit, who traded him to the Pittsburgh Penguins. On December 26, 1969, McMahon was lent to the Clippers for the balance of the season. On December 27th, Jimmy Bartlett and Jean-Marie Cossette each had 2 goals in the Clippers' road win against Hershey. The 1960s were now officially over. Nobody would have ever thought that after being benched most of the previous season and the transformation of the Clippers into a developmental team, that Baltimore's leading scorer heading into the 1970s would be 37-year-old Black Bart. The team was sitting nicely in second place and were headed for the playoffs. Jimmy started the 1970s with a bang, scoring goals in 4 straight games against Quebec, Buffalo, Montreal, and Hershey. With Bartlett in the spotlight, the Clipper games at the Civic Center was the hottest spot in town. The 69-70 Baltimore Clippers had the highest attendance of any team in Baltimore Clippers or Baltimore Skipjacks history. The Clippers were so popular that they regularly outdrew the NBA's Baltimore Bullets. On January 23, 1970, Jimmy Bartlett became only the 10th player in the history of the American Hockey League to score 300 goals when he scored against Bob Snedden in the Clippers' 9-1 rout over the Springfield Kings. The next night, against the Bears, the Clippers were losing 2-1 in the third period. Rudy Migay pulled Andy Brown with 40 seconds left of the game. After Hershey barely missed the open net, Bartlett silenced the Hershey fans when he scored the tying goal with only 2 seconds to go. The red-hot Bartlett had 7 goals in a week when he scored twice against the Buffalo Bisons on February 21st, 2 more times against the Cleveland Barons on February 26th, and 3 times for a hat trick on February 28th against the Providence Reds. When Jimmy scored on March 15th against Rochester, he passed his friend and the greatest player in the history of the Providence Reds, Zelio Topazzini, for 9th place on the American Hockey League's all-time goal list. Jimmy's goal against Providence a week later moved Bartlett past Jerry Eman for 8th place all-time. On April 3rd, Bartlett scored his 30th goal of the season when the Clippers defeated the Buffalo Bisons 5-3 at the Civic Center. When Mike McMahon scored an empty net goal with 5 seconds remaining, it was his 13th of the season, breaking Ron Ingram's Clipper record, which he accomplished in only 47 games. The Clippers finished 3rd in the Western Division behind Buffalo and Hershey and were going to the playoffs. 37-year-old Jimmy Bartlett led the team in scoring despite missing the first 7 games of the season. Jimmy was also the team's only 30-goal scorer. Bobby Rivard was second in scoring and had 21 goals. 21-year-old rookie Ron Snell was tied for 3rd on the team in scoring with Jean-Marie Cossette and was the only other 20-goal scorer on the team. Wayne Hicks had a major drop-off in production, scoring only 14 times, and so did Willie Marshall, who found the back of the net only 9 times in the 42 games that he played. Eddie McQueen and Chevy each played less than 50 games because of the developmental agreement. Doug Barrie led the team in penalty minutes. Mike McMahon was named to the league's second All-Star team and was also honored as the team's most valuable Clipper. Jimmy's feelings were really hurt when he lost that award to McMahon that year, and I know that he carried a resentment about it his entire life. The Clippers were scheduled to play the Montreal Voyageurs, who had the best record of the American Hockey League. In addition to leading the league in scoring, the Voyageurs also led the league in minor penalties, major penalties, and misconducts. They were bigger, stronger, and faster than the Clippers. Some of these Voyager players would win multiple Stanley Cups as part of the Montreal Canadiens dynasty, including Hall of Fame defenseman Guy Lapointe. Head coach Rudy Migay was unavailable for the playoffs because he needed to be with his ailing father. Just like the year before, Terry Reardon was again forced to coach the team in the postseason. On April 7th, the lifeless Clippers were easily shut out 4-0 in Game 1 after a grueling bus trip to Montreal. On April 10th, Paul McCartney quit the Beatles. He blamed the breakup on personal differences, business differences, musical differences, but according to Paul, most of all, because I have a better time with my family. I love John and I respect what he does, but it doesn't give me any pleasure. That evening, the Clippers played the Voyageurs in Game 2. Playing in his hometown of Montreal, Jimmy Bartlett and Jude Drouin brought the crowd to its feet at the 1756 mark of the first period as they got into a swinging match near the Clipper goal. The 20-year-old rookie Drouin led the American Hockey League in scoring that year. There was blood all over the ice near the end of the period when Joe Daly stopped a shot with his forehead. Indy Brown was unavailable for the playoffs because of a hernia. After getting stitched up, Daly bravely returned to the net as the second period began and played the rest of the game without a goalie mask. Although Baltimore played much better in the hard-hitting, penalty-filled second match and kept the game tight for 2 periods, the Clippers were once again beaten 6-3 by Montreal, who now had a 2-0 lead in the series. Jude Drouin and Guy Lapointe were just 2 of the Montreal Voyageurs who had played for the Central League's Houston Apollos the previous season before they relocated to Canada. On April 11, 1970, NASA launched Apollo 13. The Apollo Command and Service Module, or the CSM, was named Odyssey and was the mothership that would fly the crew to the moon. Once Odyssey achieved lunar orbit, the lunar module, or LEM, would separate from Odyssey and would land on the lunar surface where Mission Commander Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes were intended to be the 5th and 6th astronauts to ever walk on the moon. Meanwhile, Jack Swigert would remain in the orbit, piloting Odyssey, awaiting to rendezvous with the LEM before beginning the trip back home to Earth. The LEM was named Aquarius. On April 12th, the fired-up Clippers, playing back in Baltimore, came out skating as if their lives depended on a win and looked like easy victors as they took a 3-1 lead into the final period. Montreal's Guy Lapointe was checked so hard into the boards in the second period, he didn't get up, and he was taken to the hospital with possible broken ribs. Despite brilliant play by Joe Daly, Montreal closed the gap in the third period when future NHL All-Star left winger Bob Barrie scored to make it 3-2. After Gary Swain hit the goalpost on a shot that Voyager goalie Jack Norris never saw, Montreal's Marc Tardif picked up the rebound and scored an unassisted goal from the blue line that went into the net head high over Daly's left shoulder to tie the game with only 1 minute and 10 seconds left on the clock, stunning the devastated local fans. The 20-year-old Tardif would eventually be named MVP twice and would score more goals than any other player in the history of the World Hockey Association and have his number retired by the Quebec Nordiques. In sudden death overtime, Bartlett hooked Montreal's defenseman with his stick, which caused the puck to sail freely to Bobby Rivard. While Rivard shot, Jimmy went to the net. Voyager goalie Norris dropped to his knees to make the save, and Jimmy simply flipped the rebounded puck over top of him for the game winner. After Bartlett was mobbed by his teammates in jubilation, the Baltimore fans reacted with a noisy ovation highlighted by a 5-minute litter throwing display that covered the ice. That's why they call it Mobtown.
Yeah, baby, yeah!
On April 14th, after a routine stir of an oxygen tank caused an explosion in the Apollo 13's service module, Commander Jim Lovell famously informed Mission Control that, "Houston, we had a problem. With the ship losing oxygen and bleeding energy, Flight Director Gene Kranz had to cancel the moon landing. Instead, the new flight mission was just to get the astronauts home alive. In order to save whatever power was left of the fuel cells, the Apollo 13 crew completely shut down the Odyssey and instead used the LEM as a life raft. Although the LEM was never designed for spaceflight but only for landing on the moon, the astronauts hunkered down in freezing conditions. Instead of a direct abort, NASA decided to have the ship loop the moon and have the moon's gravity slingshot the crew back to Earth. During their orbit on the dark side of the moon, no person before or since has ever been further away from Earth than the 3 astronauts struggling to stay alive aboard Aquarius. On April 15th, the Clippers were looking to tie up the series with coach Rudy Migay back behind the bench. Nobody scored in the opening period in the nail-biter of a game which contained 5 fights and 17 penalties. However, in the second period, Montreal struck first when Guy Caron scored from 8 feet out on Daly on a setup from future 2-time NHL All-Star Dennis Hextall. Like Bartlett, the 20-year-old Caron was born in Verdun. The future captain of the Washington Capitals would score more than 35 goals in consecutive seasons during a lengthy NHL career. Despite numerous power plays, because Daly and Norris were both terrific, the score remained 1-0 heading into the third period. However, at 3:16 of the third period, Norris had no answer when Bartlett followed up on his own rebound for the tying goal that brought a standing ovation from the fans. Bartlett came back right after his score and nearly had another, but couldn't locate the puck just beneath his skates in front of the net. It was looking like the game would be decided once again in sudden death overtime, but with 40 seconds left to play on the clock, the Clipper fans' spirits were crushed when Caron scored for a second time. The Voyagers added an empty netter for a 3-1 win and a commanding lead in the series, sending it back to Montreal. The brilliant engineers and scientists at NASA worked day and night to try to keep the brave crew of Apollo 13 alive as the whole world was glued to their televisions praying for their safety. On April 17, 1970, with great difficulty, the crew of Apollo 13 was able to power up the command module from full shutdown. The crew abandoned the Aquarius and secured themselves in the command module and prepared for re-entry. Houston did not know if the protective heat shield was damaged in the explosion. Ionization of the air around the command module during re-entry typically caused a 4-minute communication blackout. During the blackout, all the world could do was anxiously wait. Meanwhile, a hockey game was being played that the public completely ignored. Future Hall of Fame defenseman Guy Lapointe had the hat trick in Game 5 as the Montreal Voyagers eliminated the Baltimore Clippers from the playoffs 10-3. Once again, the Baltimore Clippers failed to win the championship, but it was still a great season. Bartlett proved that he wasn't washed up, but instead was able to lead and mentor a group of kids to the playoffs. The team was at their absolute peak of popularity, and Jimmy Bartlett was loved by his teammates, the press, and the fans. The tension heightened as the ionization blackout lasted longer than expected. Just when everyone thought the worst, radio contact was established and the capsule splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. The 60s were over. It had been a decade full of hope and despair. The Flower Children remained optimistic despite a decade full of war, racism, and violence, and naively believed that we were at the start of a utopian world full of love and peace. But the counterculture had already reached its peak and would fade away during the next decade. In a way, the hippies of the 60s were like an emotional lifeboat providing optimistic nourishment during a decade of turmoil. The Apollo 13 mission was called a successful failure. Even though they failed to land on the moon, the fact that the crew was able to safely return home was a testament of American ingenuity, hard work, and teamwork. Prior to re-entry, the crew of Apollo 13 informed Mission Control that they had just jettisoned the LEM that had saved their lives. Mission Control responded, "Copy that. Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you."